This is Avery Kennedy reporting to you live from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Join me as we investigate the earthquake. We are going to start our report on earthquakes by talking to Chris Mancini, who has lived through an earthquake. How many earthquakes have you been through, and where were you?
Well, I've been through quite a few because I grew up in the San Diego, California area. And there's the San Andreas fault line there and a lot of earthquakes. So maybe 10, 15.
Can you tell me what you saw before, during, and after the earthquake?
Well, before an earthquake, you don't even know it's coming. You're just acting normal, doing whatever you're doing. And then all of a sudden, something changes and you kind of get confused. I remember one time, my mom was walking down the hall and this noise was coming and everything was shaking. I thought, boy, she must really be mad. And you know what? It wasn't my mom. There was an earthquake. And it was shaking things. Things were falling off the wall. Yet during the earthquake, you don't know how you feel. You're confused. Things don't make sense. And then afterwards you get a little scared because you realize what happened.
How did you feel during the earthquake?
Well, during the earthquake, like I said, I get confused. But afterwards is when you get scared.
What advice can you give us if we are ever in an earthquake?
Well, in school, when I was in school, they used to tell us to get under our desk and put our hands over our head, our hands behind our neck, and roll up in a ball. If you're outside somewhere, you want to make sure you stay away from all buildings, especially any broken glass that can fall and get on top of you, hurt you.
Thank you, Miss Mancini, for sharing your experience with us.
You're so welcome.
Based on my research, this is what I learned. There are millions of earthquakes every year, but we can only feel 100 of them. This is a seismograph. This is how scientists know how big an earthquake is going to be. Scientists have hundreds of seismographs all over the world. First, scientists use the seismograph, then they use the Richter scale. The Richter scale gives every earthquake a number depending how strong it was. An earthquake 6 or higher is a really big earthquake on the Richter scale. We are going to end our report on earthquakes by talking to Mark Ronchetti, the local weatherman. Why do earthquakes happen?
Well, earthquakes happen, Avery, when you get the plates which ride up along the Earth's surface. And when they come by each other and they push against each other, a lot of times they get caught. For example, when you walk by something like, you ever catch your shirt on the corner of a table and it starts to pull your shirt, right? Well, eventually what does your shirt do? It snaps, right? It kind of comes away. That's like the crust of the Earth that rides above the magma. So essentially, you get the plates that push against each other and they catch. And the plates keep moving, but that edge catches, and then eventually the edge comes off and you get an earthquake and it shakes the ground.
How do earthquakes happen?
Well, that's sort of how they happen. They push against each other, but there's really two different ways in what earthquakes happen. So we talked about the plate tectonics, right? The plates that move and slide and rub against each other and release energy. Well, they also happen at spots where there are volcanoes, right? And so what happens is you get the magma, which is underneath the volcano. It starts to push upward. Well, as that magma pushes up, it releases, and as it releases out into the atmosphere or along a mountainside, it releases energy. A lot of times you can get a major earthquake. In 1980 in Mount St. Helens, they had a major earthquake which preceded a huge eruption in Mount St. Helens that collapsed the whole side of the mountain. So it can be pretty serious stuff.
Did we get any earthquakes in Albuquerque?
Well, we don't tend to get big ones in Albuquerque. We do have a fault line in Albuquerque, but we don't tend to get big time earthquakes here in the Albuquerque area, but they do tend to see them up in the northeast occasionally, and we have heard of them down in Socorro too. A lot of the earthquakes we get in New Mexico are of the real moderate to real light variety. They're not a big deal. They don't tend to rock the earth and cause a large degree of damage. More than anything else, they tend to be little tremors that are not really felt by all that many people.
Then where do we get earthquakes?
Where do we get them? Well, we get them in a couple of different places. Heard about the San Andreas Fault in California? What you've got there are those two plates. That's an example of plate tectonics, right? Where they rub against each other and release. But another way is in the Ring of Fire, like up in the Pacific Northwest. We mentioned, say, Mount St. Helens. That's part of the Ring of Fire. Up through Japan and up into Alaska, you get a lot of eruptions up there. And in many cases, those eruptions are preceded, or even after the eruption, you can get an earthquake as well.
Does the weather change?
Well, the interesting thing is there's no direct connection between weather and earthquakes. However, when you get, like, say, for example, a volcano erupting, that can very much affect your weather. So in a way, it's a reverse. An earthquake can happen, you can get an eruption, and then what happens is all that ash in the atmosphere can reduce the amount of incoming sunlight, okay? And when you don't get as much sun, is it colder or warmer without the sun? It's colder. And so you end up affecting your weather just a little bit, right? So a lot of times, in a way, it's sort of indirect, but you can have an effect on the weather with an earthquake, which eventually leads to an eruption.
Thank you, Mr. Mark Longketty, for taking your time and helping me on my project on earthquakes.
Avery, it was my pleasure.
This ends our report. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something just like me.